There's a song that has traveled farther than most people ever will. It was born in a small Detroit studio in 1959, pressed onto vinyl, and sent out into the world with nothing but a piano groove and a voice full of hunger. Within months, it climbed the charts. Within years, it crossed an ocean. The Beatles picked it up in Liverpool, stripped it down, and gave it a second life that carried it across Europe, across Asia, across every radio frequency that mattered. The Flying Lizards reimagined it with a cold, minimalist edge that turned it into a new wave anthem. Dozens of artists across genres took their turn with it. Blues musicians bent it. Rock bands drove it harder. Soul singers softened it. Hip-hop producers sampled it. The song kept moving, kept shape-shifting, kept finding new audiences in new decades. It played at house parties and in Hollywood films. It echoed through shopping malls and stadium speakers. It became part of the vocabulary of popular music, a phrase everyone knew, a melody everyone recognized, a rhythm that never stopped pulsing. That song is called Money, That's What I Want. And if you've heard it, and I promise you have, then you already know something about the man who created it. You just don't know his name. His name is Barrett Strong. He sat down at a worn piano, followed an instinct he couldn't explain, and created a melody that became the very first major hit for a label the world would come to know as Motown. Without that song, there may have been no Motown as we understand it. Without that moment, the entire course of American popular music might have taken a different turn. And yet, Barrett Strong's name has been quietly erased from the story he helped write. Not violently, not dramatically, just slowly, gradually. The way a river smooths a stone until its original shape is forgotten. But Barrett didn't just write one song. He wrote dozens of songs that shaped an era, songs you've loved without ever knowing who held the pen, songs that gave voice to heartbreak, protest, joy, confusion, and the raw truth of American life during one of its most turbulent chapters. His words traveled through the voices of Marvin Gaye, The Temptations, Gladys Knight, and Edwin Starr. They earned Grammys. They topped charts. They became cultural landmarks. And still, when people talk about Motown, Barrett Strong's name barely registers. So here's the question that drives everything you're about to hear. What happens when a piece of art outlives the memory of the person who created it? What happens when the song lives forever, but the songwriter becomes a ghost? Sit with me for a while. Grab something warm. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Because this is a story that should have been told a long time ago. And today we are going to tell it. Before there was a hit record, before there was a studio, before there was Motown, there was a boy, a family, and a piano that changed everything. Barrett Strong was born in 1941 in West Point, Mississippi, a place where the rhythm of life moved to the beat of faith, labor, and community. His father, Barrett Strong Sr., was a preacher, a man whose voice could fill a small church room with the kind of conviction that made people close their eyes and believe. Sunday mornings in the Strong household were not quiet. They were alive with scripture, singing, and the deep hum of a family grounded in something greater than themselves. In 1945, Barrett's father made a decision that would quietly alter the course of American music. He moved his family north to Detroit. Like so many black families during the Great Migration, the Strongs were chasing opportunity, chasing safety, chasing the promise of a city that seemed to be building something new every single day. Factories were hiring, neighborhoods were forming, churches were opening their doors to Southern transplants who brought their music, their food, and their faith with them. Detroit in the late 1940s wasn't just a city, it was a living, breathing experiment in reinvention. And the Strong family landed right in the middle of it. Not long after they settled, Barrett's father brought home an old upright piano. The wood was scratched, the keys were slightly uneven. A few of them stuck if you pressed too hard. His father had dreams of teaching himself hymns, of adding another layer of praise to his Sunday sermons. But it was young Barrett who understood the instrument firsthand. He didn't read sheet music, he didn't take lessons. He simply listened, and then he played. Melodies came to him the way words come to a poet, not through study but through instinct. Something inside him already knew the language of the keys. He just needed something to play on. That piano became the center of the household. Barrett's sisters formed a gospel group called the Strong Sisters, and Barrett took his place behind them, supporting their harmonies with a maturity that startled anyone who heard it. Their home became a gathering spot for young musicians from the neighborhood. Some came for the music. Others, Barrett liked to joke, came because his sisters were beautiful. But the result was the same. The Strong living room became a rehearsal space, a jam session hub, and an incubator for talent that had nowhere else to grow. Detroit was feeding Barrett in ways he didn't fully understand yet. Black churches across the city were becoming artistic laboratories where gospel harmonies shaped young voices into instruments of power. Radio stations filled the air with blues, jazz, and the earliest experiments in rhythm and blues. The city's cultural energy was rising so fast you could almost feel it vibrating through the pavement. Barrett wasn't just growing up in Detroit, he was absorbing the soundtrack of a generation that was about to change everything. At Hutchins Middle School, Barrett crossed paths with a girl named Aretha Franklin. They were just kids then. Two students sharing hallways, classrooms, and the quiet early sparks of something extraordinary. No one in that building could have predicted what either of them would become. But the air around them was thick with ambition, and both of them were breathing it in deeply. Among the young musicians who passed through the Strong household was Jackie Wilson, a man on the edge of becoming one of the most electrifying performers of his era. Jackie heard Barrett play and recognized something he couldn't quite name. Talent, yes, but something deeper, a feel for melody that went beyond skill. Through Wilson, Barrett was introduced to a man named Berry Gordy, a songwriter with sharp ears, a sharper mind, and a vision for something no one had built before. Barrett sat down at a piano and sang "Drown in My Own Tears," a Ray Charles classic. His voice was young, unpolished, and full of an emotion that couldn't be faked. Gordy listened, and Gordy knew. Barrett Strong walked into Berry Gordy's world carrying everything Detroit had given him. The faith of his father, the rhythm of the churches, the instinct he'd sharpened on that scratched-up piano, the ambition of a city that believed in transformation. He carried all of it. What he didn't carry was the knowledge of what was about to happen. He didn't know that the studio he was walking into would both lift him up and erase his name. He didn't know that the next chapter of his life would begin with a moment of pure creation and end with a decades-long fight to be remembered for it. The recording sessions at Motown in those earliest days were nothing like what the music industry would later become. There were no corporate executives hovering, no marketing strategies pinned to the wall. Just a handful of young musicians crowded into a modest studio, playing with instinct and hunger, and the kind of energy that only exists when people have nothing to lose and everything to prove. Barrett was one of the first through the door. He was quieter than some of the others, less flashy, less eager to perform. But when he sat at the piano, something shifted. The room would settle, the noise would pull back. Barrett had a way of drawing attention not by demanding it, but by creating a sound so honest that you couldn't look away from it. In 1959, during a session that no one expected to become historic, Barrett began playing around with a groove. He had Ray Charles's "What Did I Say" stuck in his head, not the melody, but the energy. The way it moved people, the way it commanded the room. Barrett didn't try to copy it. He pushed the rhythm into something harder, something more urgent, something that felt like Detroit itself. The bass locked in, the drums followed, the room started moving with him. Musicians layered groove upon groove until Barrett landed on a phrase that fused everything together. Money. That's what I want. It wasn't polished. It wasn't designed by committee. It was raw, restless, and completely real. And Berry Gordy, standing in the corner of that room, knew exactly what he was hearing. He was hearing the future. When "Money, That's What I Want" was released, it didn't whisper. It announced itself. The song climbed to number 2 on the R&B chart and reached number 23 on the Billboard Hot 100. For a tiny emerging label operating out of a converted house in Detroit, that was seismic. Motown had its first national hit, and Barrett Strong was the voice, the pianist, and the creative force behind it. Think about that for a moment. The song that launched an empire, the record that proved Motown could compete on a national stage, the single that opened every door that followed. That song belonged to Barrett Strong. Without it, the world might never have heard of Motown at all. But what happened next tells you everything you need to know about the industry Barrett had entered. Almost immediately, the songwriting credits began to shift. Barrett's name appeared on the record, then disappeared. It reappeared when the copyright was renewed, then vanished again. A legal cloud formed over the very song that had given Motown its identity. The details were complicated, the disputes long, and the resolution never fully clean. But the effect was simple and devastating. The man who had created the spark was being separated from his own fire. His name flickered on and off the credits, like a light with a faulty connection. The song kept living. Barrett's claim to it kept fading. Meanwhile, Motown was expanding rapidly. New artists were arriving every week. Smokey Robinson was writing and singing with a polish that captivated Gordy. Marvin Gaye was emerging as a performer of extraordinary depth. The Supremes, the Miracles, the Temptations. The roster was growing, and the competition inside the label was becoming fierce. Gordy's attention naturally shifted toward the artists he believed could carry long-term commercial appeal. Barrett didn't fit neatly into that vision, not because he lacked talent, but because the kind of talent he had didn't perform well under a spotlight. It performed best behind a closed door, with a pen in hand and silence in the room. Barrett released several more singles. None of them gained the traction that Money had. By 1962, he made the difficult decision to leave Motown. He packed what he had and moved to Chicago, a city with its own deep musical roots, its own studios, its own opportunities. He recorded for Atco and Tolly Records. He kept trying. He kept performing. But the commercial breakthrough he was looking for stayed out of reach. And then, quietly, something important began to happen. Not on a stage, not in front of a crowd, but in the silence between sessions, in the notebooks he carried with him, in the way he turned disappointment into language. Barrett was writing, and the words he was putting on paper were far more powerful than anything his voice had ever delivered into a microphone. Barrett Strong didn't know it yet, but his future wasn't waiting behind a microphone. It was waiting behind a pen. His greatest chapter wasn't going to be sung. It was going to be written. Chicago had given Barrett clarity. Not success, not fame, but something more valuable. The understanding of who he truly was. He had spent years trying to be the voice in the room, the face behind the microphone, the performer the crowd would remember. But the truth had been forming quietly beneath the surface all along. Barrett Strong was never meant to be heard. He was meant to be read. His gift lived in the words, in the way he could translate raw human experience into lyrics that moved millions. During his time in Chicago, Barrett co-wrote Stay in My Corner with Wade Flemons and Bobby Miller. It became a solid hit for the Dells in 1965. When they re-recorded it in 1968, the song climbed to #1 on the R&B chart and cracked the top 10 on the pop chart. Barrett's name didn't become a household word, but something more important happened. He proved to himself that his real artistry lived on the page. With that knowledge, Barrett returned to Detroit. Motown had transformed in his absence. It was no longer a scrappy startup running sessions in a converted house. It was a rising empire with stars, producers, choreographers, and a sound that was defining an era. Barrett walked back through those doors not as a performer looking for a second chance, but as a songwriter who finally understood where he belonged. And then he met his other half. Norman Whitfield was already known inside Motown as a man who pushed boundaries. He had bold ideas about rhythm, texture, and the emotional range that soul music could carry. But Whitfield needed a lyricist who could match his ambition, someone who could write with both precision and feeling, someone who understood that a great song doesn't just entertain, it speaks. Barrett was that person. From the moment they began working together in 1967, something extraordinary started to form. Their first major breakthrough was I Heard It Through the Grapevine. Barrett wrote lyrics that carried the tension of a whispered secret, the dread of a truth you don't want to confirm, and the heartbreak of betrayal felt before it's even spoken aloud. Gladys Knight and the Pips recorded the song first and turned it into a hit. But when Marvin Gaye's version arrived a year later, the world understood the magnitude of what Barrett and Whitfield had created. That recording became one of Motown's most iconic moments. Haunting, emotional, unmistakable. And at the center of it, invisible to the public, was Barrett Strong's pen. The world remembered Marvin's voice. The world forgot the man who gave him the words. But Barrett and Whitfield were only getting started. Their work with the Temptations pushed the legendary group into territory no one at Motown had dared to enter. Instead of polished harmonies and romantic themes, they brought psychedelic textures, bold rhythms, and lyrics that reflected the chaos and beauty of a country in transformation. Cloud 9 arrived like a jolt, fresh, experimental, almost rebellious. It earned Motown its very first Grammy Award. Think about that, the first Grammy in Motown's history. Barrett Strong's words were on that record. Then came War. With Whitfield's explosive arrangement and Barrett's blunt, urgent lyrics, the song confronted the anxieties of a nation torn between conflict abroad and unrest at home. When Edwin Starr recorded it, his voice roared through the mix like a siren that refused to stop. War climbed to #1. It became a cultural moment. It captured the frustration and the courage of an entire generation. And Barrett Strong wrote those words. I Can't Get Next to exploded with energy and went straight to #1. Psychedelic Shack blended vivid imagery with Barrett's fearless storytelling. Ball of Confusion felt like a newsreel compressed into a 3-minute whirlwind of rhythm and truth. Barrett's lyrics tumbled line after line, naming the fractures in American society without preaching, capturing chaos without losing musicality. These weren't just singles, they were statements, bold, relevant, and unmistakably ahead of their time. And then Barrett proved something that silenced any question about the range of his talent. Just My Imagination stripped away every layer of experimentation and delivered a soft, longing ballad that shimmered with vulnerability. A dreamer's heartache, captured with quiet restraint. It went to #1. It reminded the world that the same man who wrote War could also write tenderness so delicate it made you hold your breath. And then came Papa Was a Rollin' Stone, a 7-minute masterpiece, a meditation on family, absence, truth, and the weight of inherited stories. It won a Grammy. It became one of Motown's most celebrated achievements. Decades later, it is still studied, still covered, still revered. Barrett Strong wrote that. He wrote Thunder, and he wrote tenderness. He wrote protest, and he wrote longing. He expanded the boundaries of what soul music could say. He gave black artists the language to address war, addiction, confusion, hope, and the search for meaning in mainstream spaces that had never welcomed those conversations before. Barrett Strong didn't just write songs. He changed what songs were allowed to be. And through all of it, the world remembered the voices. The world remembered the performers. The world remembered the names on the stage. But the man behind the pen, the architect who built the rooms that everyone else stood in, he remained invisible. Here's the cruelest truth about the music industry. It rewards the face, not the hand that writes the words behind it. At the very height of his creative power, Barrett Strong was shaping the direction of Motown in ways no one could deny. His lyrics were carrying the weight of a changing America. His collaborations with Norman Whitfield were pushing the label into bold new territory. But even in this brilliant season, shadows were forming. Subtle at first, then unmistakable. Motown's stars were appearing on national television. They were touring the world. They were becoming household names, magazine covers, Hollywood parties, screaming crowds. That was the life of a Motown performer. But songwriters lived a different life entirely. Barrett's contributions were recognized within the walls of the studio. Engineers knew, producers knew, the musicians who played his melodies knew. But the public had no idea who was behind the lyrics that shaped the records they loved. Barrett Strong's name never appeared on a magazine cover. He wasn't invited to the glamorous circles. No crowd ever chanted his name from a concert seat. He built the rooms. Other people stood in them. And the applause was never directed his way. The wound from money still had not healed. Through the years, his songwriting credit appeared on the record, then vanished. It reappeared during copyright renewals, then slipped away again. Think about what that does to a person. You create the song that launches an entire empire, and your name on that song flickers like a broken streetlight. Present, absent, present, absent. The song keeps living. Your connection to it keeps dying. Then came the rupture that changed everything. In the early 1970s, Berry Gordy made the decision to move Motown from Detroit to Los Angeles. It was a business decision. It was a symbolic one, too. The gritty, soulful, community-driven spirit of Detroit Motown was giving way to a glossier, more commercial West Coast phase. For some artists, the move meant new opportunities. For others, it felt like a betrayal, like the heart of the machine had been ripped out and shipped across the country. Barrett chose to stay in Detroit. It was a quiet decision. He didn't make a statement, he didn't fight, he simply stayed. Detroit was where he had found his voice, where he had shaped history, where his father had preached, where his sisters had sung, where that old piano had unlocked something inside him that nothing else could reach. Leaving felt like abandoning the very thing that made him who he was. But staying had a cost. The phone calls from Motown became less frequent. The sessions dried up. The partnership with Whitfield, once so effortless and electric, gradually faded as Whitfield moved deeper into the Los Angeles operation. Barrett was still respected, still admired, but he was no longer essential to the machinery. The wave he had helped create was now crashing hundreds of miles away, and Barrett stood on the shore, watching. He tried again as a performer. He signed with Epic Records and released Stand Up and Cheer for the Preacher in 1973. It had heart, but it didn't have the spark needed to climb. He moved to Capitol Records, Stronghold in 1975, Live in Love in 1976. Both albums were soulful and sincere. Both were met with silence from an industry that had already moved on. He released Love Is You in 1980. Another honest effort. Another quiet landing. Each project carried the echo of a man who once shaped the soundtrack of a generation, and each one reminded him that the distance between what he had given and what he had received was growing wider every year. But Barrett Strong never became bitter. He didn't chase controversy. He didn't demand credit in public. He didn't throw himself at the spotlight. He worked. He wrote. He carried no resentment into his music. Instead, he let the complexity of life, its hope, its sorrow, its quiet, injustice, flow through his pen the way it always had, with honesty, with restraint, with a dignity that made his silence more powerful than any speech. The man whose words had once given voice to a generation's anger, confusion, and longing was now living the very experience his songs had described. Overlooked, undervalued, still creating, still believing that the work would speak for itself even when the industry no longer spoke for him. The years continued to pass, and the world Barrett had helped build moved further away from him. Detroit itself was changing. Factories closed, neighborhoods shifted. The creative community that had once surrounded him became quieter, scattered, absorbed into memory, but Barrett stayed rooted. He held on to the rhythms of the city that had made him, even as the industry that had once embraced him seemed to forget he existed. In 1995, Barrett founded Blair Records, a small Detroit-based label built to nurture emerging artists. It was an act of faith as much as it was a business venture. He hoped to give young musicians the same chance Berry Gordy had once given him. The label released a handful of projects, modest efforts filled with heart but without the marketing power to reach wide audiences. Barrett didn't care. He was no longer chasing the mainstream. He was cultivating creativity in places the industry had overlooked. He was paying it forward. In 2004, recognition finally arrived. Barrett Strong and Norman Whitfield were inducted into the Songwriters Hall of Fame. The honor came decades after their greatest work, but it carried weight that time could not diminish. For those who knew the depth of Barrett's contribution, the moment felt overdue. For Barrett, it was quiet validation. He accepted the honor without spectacle, without fanfare, with the same humility that had defined every chapter of his life. And then the body did what the industry had been doing for years. It began to erase him. In 2009, Barrett suffered a stroke that forced him into retirement. The mind that had always been sharp, always poetic, always searching for the right word to unlock an emotion, was now slowed by limitations he could not write his way out of. The studio rooms filled with his memories fell silent. The pen that had shaped generations of music came to rest. For a man whose entire life had moved to the rhythm of creation, this silence was perhaps the deepest loss of all. Barrett Strong passed away in 2023 in San Diego. He was 81 years old. There were no farewell tours, no documentary crews waiting outside his door, no grand public ceremonies, just the slow, gentle passing of time. And the knowledge, quiet but undeniable, that his contributions were woven into the fabric of a nation's culture, even if the world didn't speak his name often enough. But the songs never stopped. They kept traveling. Streaming platforms carried Grapevine, and Papa was a rolling stone into the ears of new generations who marveled at how contemporary the lyrics still felt. European rock bands covered his work with gritty reinterpretations. Soul enthusiasts in Japan celebrated his writing as foundational to global R&B culture. In the UK, Money remained a cross-generational anthem. Barrett's music crossed borders, languages, and decades without ever needing his face on a magazine cover. Time, it turns out, has a way of clarifying what fame once obscured. Barrett Strong's life ended quietly, but his work did not, and it never will. Somewhere in the world right now, Money, That's What I Want is playing, in a car, in a coffee shop, in someone's headphones, on a crowded train. Somewhere a Marvin Gaye record is spinning and the words Barrett Strong wrote are moving through someone's chest the way they have for more than 60 years. But now you know something most listeners don't. You know the name behind those words. You know the story. You know about the scratched-up piano in a Detroit living room, about the boy who learned by ear, about the first hit that launched an empire, and the man who watched his name flicker on and off the credits like a ghost, about the partnership that redefined Motown, about the songs that challenged America to look at itself honestly, about the silence that followed and the dignity with which it was carried. Barrett Strong's story is not just his story. It belongs to every artist whose contribution built the foundation of something the world loves, but whose name was quietly left out of the conversation. Every songwriter who shaped a hit someone else performed. Every musician who built the groove someone else danced to. Every creator who gave more to their craft than the craft ever gave back. Barrett stands for all of them. His legacy is not loud. It never was. It is the steady echo that never fades, even when the world moves on. So now the moment shifts to you. If this story touched something in you, share it. Not for this video. For Barrett. For the artists that history almost forgot. Tell me in the comments, which of his songs still lingers in your memory? Which lyric hit you in a way you can't explain? Drop your thoughts below. Let this comment section become a place where Barrett Strong's name lives the way it always should have. Loud, honored, and remembered. And if you want to help keep these stories alive, the stories of the people who built the music we love but never got the credit they deserved, then subscribe. Join us. Because we are going to keep finding these stories, keep telling them, and keep making sure the world remembers. Barrett, if you can hear us, we know, we remember. And we are not going to let them forget, because the world may forget,